Good morning, and welcome to St. Paul United Church of Christ, Keokuk.
In sorrow he's my comfort.
In trouble he's my stay.
He's the fairest of 10,000,
my joy
upon my way. He all my grief has taken, he all my sorrows bore. I've all for him forsaken, from my heart all idols scorn.
Though all the world forsake me,
And Satan tempt me sore,
he will never leave me
till my life on earth is o'er. When my life on earth is over, and I have run this race,
and
sweetly up to heaven, I'll see his blessed face. The lily of the valley, he keeps me by his power. His power, I found a friend in Jesus. He's the bright and morning star.
I found a friend in Jesus. He's my bright and morning star.
Children, come forward for the children's sermon. Yes, come right on up here. There we go. Running in church. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Do you ever eat bread? No? Do you eat bread? Do you have sandwiches? You know, the best sandwiches are the ones that your mother makes, aren't they? I always felt that the best sandwiches were the ones that my mother made. There was something about it, it just tasted so good. So bread helps us quite a lot. And there used to be a bread called Wonder Bread. And it builds bodies. How many ways, congregation? Oh, come on. Some of you remember? No? Oh, my goodness. 12 ways. 12 ways. It's back, along with the Hostess Twinkie. Somebody bought out the company there. And yes. So that's so that kids' bodies can be built up. You know what it's for? It's for energy. Yeah. So that you have... Are there times when you don't have any energy? You can't move around, right? You're tired? There are times like that. Well, Jesus is like bread. Jesus gives us energy. We feel better because we believe in Jesus and we follow Jesus. So we feel better, we feel more full of energy. And that's something that I want you to remember for today. If you're feeling tired or discouraged or something, maybe you've done something wrong and you're grounded. You ever been grounded? Sure. No, huh?
You're lucky.
You'll feel better.
You guys are very
You'll feel
lucky.
better if you're following Jesus. You'll be grounded in the future, I'm sure. All right, let's pray together. Lord,
Lord,
thank you
thank you
for giving us
for giving us
energy.
energy.
Amen.
Amen.
Pennies for heaven. Time to use your energy for pennies for heaven. That's right. Go get those pennies. Those pennies that weren't working for the kingdom before, but now they are. You have very important work to do when you pick up those pennies. Because last time, for a couple of months, I think we had over $200 in pennies. So you're really helping quite a lot. And of course, on Ash Wednesday, I surprised everybody because nobody thought we were going to have pennies for heaven, and we got more dollars than pennies. So, yes. So this helps a lot, and we're glad that you can help us in this way. At all ages, you are very valuable and helpful for the church. At all ages, you are very valuable and helpful for the church. And this is something for you kids to remember. Bread is often called the staff of life. Now, I grew up on the farm, so they would make bread from dough, and they'd be rolling the dough and kneading the dough and making sure the yeast got into all parts of the dough. Now, as I understand it, we're probably going to have some bread, I think, maybe this morning after the worship service. But nevertheless, it really smelled good. All parts of it, really. Oh, of course, the dough was a little bit sour, but when that bread was baking, that was some really good stuff. And we all looked forward to when the bread would be done. One of the reasons why they did that so much was because we did a lot of exercise on the farm, because we tossed bales, we had to milk cows, we had to do chores, we had to fork silage over to the cows. We had to do all that sort of thing. So we were always moving. And the calories that we got from bread would just be burned up because they would give to us energy. So bread is a very important part of people's lives, and was a very important part of people's lives in the Bible, because during biblical times, a lot of their work was also done agriculturally. So the end result of that was that you were out doing things for the sheep or the cattle, and your wealth was actually measured quite often in terms of how many cattle you had and that sort of thing. Now what we do is we go to the store and we get our meat, we go to the store and we get our eggs. I talked to somebody once and I just couldn't believe this, because I grew up on the farm, and I said, well, where did your eggs come from? And he said, well, they've got a factory that makes these things. And I thought, boy, we are far removed from what I'm used to. And it's true other places as well. As you know, this isn't in relation to farm products, but in LA, they quite often have hazy skies, skies that are full of smog. Well, one night things came in and just cleared everything off, so people were able to see the stars in the Milky Way, and they called in because of this strange thing they were seeing in the sky. So we're so far removed from that time of the use of our muscles and so forth, we have to go out of our way in order to use muscles. We have to actually go and exercise, or we have to walk for several miles. So we have these Fitbits and all sorts of things that show how far we walked. We have to go to the Y and we have to move our muscles because being very sedentary and everything, we just don't do what we used to do on the farm. There was one time when the farm population was the biggest population, and eventually people moved to the cities because there were jobs there and factories and so forth, and they were trying to better themselves. But in the time of my father, the farm was a place where people could always go in order to raise a family, the family farm. He used to say over and over, if there isn't anything else you can do, you can always farm. So it was great in that respect, but it was very physical. It was very physical. There were a lot of things that you had to do on the farm. What I remember most of all was throwing bales of hay, putting them on an elevator, putting them in the loft, taking them down from the loft, feeding the cattle, all sorts of things like that. Well, bread helped you with that because it gave you the energy that you need. Now people avoid eating bread because they're afraid that they're going to put on a few pounds. And you certainly can if you eat a lot of bread, because the body is very practical. It just stores the stuff for the time that you might be doing a lot of exercise, which never comes because you ride here and there and that sort of thing, and very seldom engage in exercise unless you make work of going ahead and doing some exercise of one kind or another. So our society is a little less involved in all sorts of physical activity. So I have to bring you up to speed as to what bread really does, why it is so important. Because in our society, we eat it because it tastes good. There was a time in the past when we ate it because we needed to have the energy. And it was very important in relation to that. Bread converts to energy, and if you're very active, then you need to have that. And today, if you have a farm, you have a tractor in which you can listen to concert music, and there's a GPS which even steers for you. As a matter of fact, you don't have to steer until you get to the end of the row, and it'll just take over your tractor for you, so you don't even have to do that. So you see, we live in a whole different time in which bread may have a different meaning than it did before. I have in the animal world, we can see it. Has anyone ever seen a crow in Keokuk, for example? Oh, sure. There's a lot of them. They're flying all over the place. Well, I have an experiment going in which I give them old bread that I've gotten for free. And they give me back things. It's called gifting. So they'll bring back a little piece of broken mirror, or they'll bring back a brightly colored piece of plastic, and they'll lay it at my back door. So I have a bright blue cable tie and all sorts of stuff like that. It's a kind of an experiment because I saw on Netflix one day that they would actually gift you if you feed them, and they certainly do. They bring these little things. But they're flying all the time, and they really like that bread because they need the energy that it provides. They need the energy that it provides. In our modern society, however, not so much because we're weight conscious and we don't have as much movement. The children don't have as much movement because they have more screen time. Or maybe they're binging on Netflix, which I have a tendency to do sometimes. That's why I found out about the crows and what they do. But they don't move around very much. And as a result, bread doesn't have the same role. It's not as vital, not as crucial in our lives as it did in the past from a physical standpoint. But children have a tendency to need it a bit more. They need bread to energize them, and we can see from them that it's very important. we can see from them that it's very important. Now, you don't want to feed them too much because that's going to sugar them up, and then they'll have more energy than they know what to do with. But nevertheless, it does give us an idea of how important bread is. And I mentioned Wonder Bread, which builds the body 12 ways. I've never forgotten about that. Bread had to be supplemented because it's mostly giving us energy, but it had to be supplemented in order to build the body 12 ways. But nevertheless, it gives you an idea of how important it was. And one other thing that I'd like to mention in relation to the importance of bread, there were a couple of emperors, a couple of rulers, Napoleon, Frederick the Great, who may have said, or it's attributed to them, an army marches on its stomach. So in the ancient world, labor intensive, and with all of the armies that they had, bread literally built empires. It literally built empires. You could not run an army without bread and wheat and that sort of thing. You could not run an empire without bread because people just didn't have the energy. You needed protein, of course, to build muscle, but to run muscle, you needed bread. So essentially, in the ancient world, the empires that we saw, the conquerors that we saw, who depended on their armies, they depended on bread. That's how important it was. You could build muscle with the protein and meat. You could not run it unless you had stuff like bread. Muscles run on stuff like that. And your brain as well. So you can't really develop plans for conquering other countries because your brain runs on sugar. And if you don't have enough, you can't think very well. And as a result, you're not going to be making good decisions. I remember one day, I think it was yesterday, I was very busy and didn't eat. And as it turned out, I noticed I was running a little bit low on sugar, not thinking very well, and so you know what that feels like. So I had a couple of Butterfingers, and I took care of that right away. But you can see how important bread is. No wonder Jesus mentioned it. Because it provides the energy. And I'll tell you, in our spiritual lives, bread is just as important as it always was. It's just as important as it always was. The bread of life, which Jesus gives to us, which gives us the energy that we need to have our spiritual lives. It essentially runs the spiritual life that we have. So we have to partake of the teachings of Jesus in order to have the energy that we need. Unfortunately, in our society, quite often right now, we feel as though we don't need to partake of that bread. And there's a funny thing about that bread. It's like that manna in the wilderness that was given to the people of Israel when they didn't have any food, which was like a frost on the ground. You could collect it, but you could only keep it for a day. It wouldn't store up. Well, the bread of life that Jesus gives to us does not store up. It doesn't store as fat. You can't use it later. It doesn't sit in the liver as glucose. No, you can't. It's every day. It's every day that you need the bread of life that comes from Jesus if you're going to be energized spiritually. There was a story that was told in relation to the coronavirus, and Pence was put in charge of that. And as I understand it, he started the meetings with prayer when he first started to meet with the people, and that was met with, people were making fun of that. But nevertheless, I thought to myself, you know what? He understands what energy is. If God's energy is to be part of what we're doing in terms of giving us wisdom, and if we are to be energized spiritually, that would be the way to begin. And every day, because We can't store that up as fat. We can't store that up like we store up bread. So as it turns out, we need to have the energy that Jesus gives to us every day. We need a dose of that every day. Because like that manna in the wilderness, it can't be stored up. And Jesus understood how himself, as the bread of life, he would give life to things. He understood that. And in our society today, one of the things that we fail to understand is that, generally speaking, and what the church helps to provide an understanding to people about, is that you need to have that energy, that spiritual energy, every single day. Every single day. That's why when we talk about people attending church less and that sort of thing, and we talk about the way in which people don't spend as much spiritual time as they did in the past, we begin to realize that people are sort of malnourished. And they have a kind of just kind of a malaise, kind of a, you know how a kid will get when they don't have enough energy? They don't have breakfast, say, when they go to school. That's one of the reasons why schools will feed kids and stuff like that. They don't have enough energy. They can't run their brain and stuff like that. Well, our society is like that. Well, they think, basically, I can do that at any time. I can go to church at any time if I happen to need it. But the thing is, you can't store it up. Yeah, you need it every week, and you need to have it every day. The bread of life, which Jesus gives to us, which is the spiritual life that we simply can't live without. See, we can do all sorts of things physically. We can make all kinds of plans. We can do all kinds of things. But what really makes a difference, when you're in a crisis or when you need to survive, what really makes a difference is whether or not you have the spiritual strength to endure. People found it when they were in concentration camps. They found it when they were in prisoner of war camps. Why, they didn't have enough to eat. Sometimes what they did have to eat was full of worms and that sort of thing. But what really sustained them wasn't physical, it was spiritual. That's what sustained them. If you look at survival stories, people who've survived under terrible circumstances and so forth, they had firm beliefs. It was spiritual. It was the bread of life. That's what sustained them during those times. That's what gives us strength and energy for living life, is that bread of life of which we have to partake every day in order to have the energy to live every day. Can't be stored up. It's like that manna in the wilderness. It just simply can't be stored up. So what do? We look at the word of Jesus Christ, that we should love one another. We look at the word of Jesus Christ, that Christ is going to be there in times of trouble and travail. We look at the ways in which we can have faith, and we partake of the bread of life. I'll give you a specific example. The disciples were very much afraid one day. Jesus was sleeping at the front of the boat, and they were very much afraid because they had a storm. And the storm was kicking up huge waves. And those waves were splashing over the boat. They couldn't keep ahead of it. They were afraid they were going to be swamped. And Jesus was just sleeping away. And the disciples were very distressed. And because of their distress, they didn't think about that the bread of life was right there with them. All they needed spiritually for survival was right there. And they, in alarm, they woke up Jesus and they said, "We're going to be overwhelmed. We're going to sink." Jesus, as a matter of factly as can be, rubbed his eyes, yawned probably, stretched a little bit, stood up, told the waves to be still, the storm to be still, turned to his disciples and said, "Where's your faith? I was here all the time. Where's your faith?" It's always faith that in the bread of life that makes the difference. Where is your faith? And then they said, "Well, who is this that can calm the waves, still the storm?" They could hardly believe it. I'll tell you what, when you hook into the bread of life for your energy every day, it's going to be unbelievable how much you're going to have in terms of being able to live under whatever circumstances you might have to live. It'll be unbelievable. Sometimes for those people who were in prisoner of war camps or concentration camps, it was unbelievable to the other prisoners that you had people who, no matter what the circumstances happened to be, seemed to be able to have the energy to move forward. Well, we know why. We know why, because no matter what, Jesus is there, and Jesus is our bread, and Jesus is the one who gives us the energy to help us to move forward in life. Guaranteed. Every day. But you can't store it up. You have to exercise faith. You have to be in prayer. You have to look at the Word of God. And then you have the bread that will satisfy. Listen to what Jesus said. "Very truly I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." "Sir," they said, "always give us this bread." The bread that we have from Jesus Christ takes us away from spiritual malnutrition. And we experienced an energized life if we partake in the bread of life by believing in Jesus. We move forward with confidence. We move forward with confidence, and we have the peace that came to the disciples when Jesus stilled the storm. The bread of life courses through us and makes us feel warm and energized. The world will say, "Look at all these circumstances around us." And we say, "That's fine. I have the bread of life." And I just go on forward and do my life and live my life in the joy of Jesus Christ. I have the bread of life. Well, look at the high waves. Look at all of this. Look at that. No, I'm going to keep my eyes on Jesus Christ. I'm going to keep my gaze fixed on Jesus Christ, the bread of life, and I'm going to partake of that Christ who died on the cross, who overcame sin and death and gave me life. That's where my energy comes from, and it has no end. And I partake in it every day. The bread of life. Partake of the bread of life. Feel its goodness. Feel the goodness of the bread of life which we find when we come to the cross. That's where restless wandering and listlessness and being scared of everything will end. For we're energized at all times and for all time by the bread of life. Amen.
You have been listening to St. Paul United Church of Christ, 2030 Plank Road, Keokuk. Join our worship service at 10 a.m. with fellowship hour immediately following. Until next week, may God bless.